bit different, different cuts, slightly different colors, and of course you'd also be able to tell if you looked closely at the buttons, which normally have regimental numbers printed onto them. In this case, me and Ben are representing the 89th Regiment of Foot from Northern Ireland, and Ethan in the middle is representing the Régiment de Watteville from Switzerland originally. Although by this point they hadn't been back to Switzerland in 20 years, so most of them outside the officers were no longer Swiss. These regiments, though, were two of the regiments that fought here in Niagara during the War of 1812, especially at the siege. The de Wattevilles particularly assaulted the works here during the night of August 15th and took significant casualties for their involvement. Now, the final person that we have down at the end, Dalton, is not representing a member of the British Army, but he's also not representing a member of the U.S. Army. That's because he's representing a member of the militia. Being in the militia was very simple. If you were an able-bodied citizen male between the ages of 16 and 60 in Canada, or 18 and 45 in the United States, congratulations, you're a member of the militia if you're called upon for service for the next 6 to 8 months. Trying to get out of militia service without some kind of legitimate excuse, like, say, the fact that you make guns for a living, could get you jailed and fined. So it's a requirement of citizenship. That means that the vast majority of the male population in many places were technically part of the militia, and because of that, money was a little bit tight individually. That means that most militia soldiers, especially in Canada, didn't get uniforms. Instead, they wear what he has, more or less, something from their own dresser drawer. In this case, that's a frock coat, so very good at hiding you in the woods and keeping you camouflaged. However, you might wonder if camouflage was here, why everyone didn't try to wear it, because the rest of us are dressed a little bit differently, in bright red coats with tall, shiny, goofy-looking hats and shoot-me-here X's right in the middle of our chest. It might not seem great, but this is the kind of uniform that most soldiers preferred, and that comes down to the weapons and what we're going to be firing for. What Dalton and Ethan there are going to give you a closer look at is the Brown Bess musket. This is the standard firearm for British Army soldiers, and it's pretty much technologically what everyone was using back then. That pan on the side that they're showing you is where you start loading. You pour in loose gunpowder to prime the weapon, you then close it back up, put the rest of the charge down the barrel from the front, and then pull the hammer at the rear. That hammer contains a flint stone, and when you pull the trigger, the flint flies forward, strikes the steel, and scrapes off sparks. That should then land in the pan, which should start a chain reaction of burning gunpowder that'll send the round downfield. But you might have noticed, should comes up a few times when you talk about them. That's because there are problems with the guns. The first of them being they're not that reliable. Even on a clear, calm, dry day like we have now, when it's clean, these weapons could have a misfire rate of 20% or more. And if it's really wet and rainy and this gets soaked, it turns into a very good club instead of a firearm. The second problem is accuracy. These weapons are not rifled. That means there's nothing on the inside, those twisting grooves, to grip the bullet and spin it out in a straight line at high velocity. Most firearms today have it, but 200 years ago, you had to do it by hand, and that made it time-consuming and expensive and more difficult to load. So most soldiers aren't given rifles. Instead, they have a smooth-bore musket. The inside of the barrel is just as smooth as the outside, and that should mean that you have a nice, easy way of loading the ball down the barrel, which will be smaller than the barrel. That means that when you fire it, it's not spinning at high velocity, it's rattling its way back down. Wherever it hits last, it'll veer off in the opposite direction. So past maybe 70 yards, you're probably not going to hit your intended knee-shaped target, and at 200 yards, where a rifle could pretty much hit anything it was aiming, these weapons could miss their intended target by up to 9 feet in any direction around them. Very big margin of error, which might explain why you see them doing what they do in the movies. Those big, long lines, marching in formation and firing en masse. There's a few hundred of them. You tend to get rid of those first two problems by process of elimination. You have enough lead going downfield that you'll eventually hit something that you want to. However, when you fight like that, you produce another big problem, which brings us back to the bright, gaudy uniforms. These weapons create a lot of smoke. You're going to see two weapons here firing about half a tablespoon or so of gunpowder per shot, and you'll see how much smoke that makes. You might then imagine if there were 1,000 of them firing 3 times a minute again and again for too long, there's so much smoke on the field, many people can't really identify their targets past the distance that you folks are from our line down there, which is not a lot of time to decide whether or not you're going to kill someone. That's a bit of a problem. So for most soldiers in the British and the American Army, they prefer to wear bright, colorful clothing because it quickly identified themselves to their friends. That's important because if they don't know who you are, they shoot first and ask questions later. And that's something you'd like to avoid. With that, though, we'll get their bayonets unfixed, we'll get them moving out, and our shooters will crack off a few shots.
One step forward, disperse, march.
Here we go. Whip, bang, cartridge, 5 men, load! That's the standard order telling them to load at their own time. Taking out a cartridge filled with gunpowder, they'll bite off the top, spit some of the powder into the dish, and then put the rest of it down the barrel. That will include the musket ball, which itself should be inside the barrel, but isn't always put there today just because our insurance company doesn't like us firing bullets. Today, it's just the black powder. It's a very simple process. You can see them forcing everything to the bottom. That's a necessary step, and all told, it's pretty quick, but pretty labor-intensive. So something that you need is some upper body strength. With that, though, they're ready to fire, and I'll warn you guys, it's a little bit loud, so plugging up your ears isn't a bad idea. But if you want to take a shot with the camera, the best time to hit your trigger is when I yell fire. That's when they're going to pull their triggers. All right, here we go. Freeze up! Fire! Arm and load! All right, 2 good shots out of our shooters, and you'll see all the smoke produced just by those 2 weapons. Pretty significant. You'll also notice at this point, though, they're standing up to do all of this, which also might not seem like a great idea. They're making themselves a pretty big target, and that's a problem. Because of that, though, they can load more quickly, and that's important on open ground. You have nothing to cover you but moving quickly and shooting quickly. Your officers know that, so more often than not, especially for the redcoats, they force you to stand up under gunfire so that you can give as well as you're going. With that, though, one more time, fingers crossed, one more shot. Freeze up! Fire! Spring rammer! Get it working! There we can see the issues inherent with the weapons. It's not a complete musket demonstration without at least one misfire. That can be for a number of reasons, the most common of them being the powder. Historically, that powder was transported from long distances, and black powder likes to attract moisture, but it can't have moisture if it wants to burn. Bit of a problem for storage, so if it's old powder, it simply might not be burning. If you're very unlucky, though, you might find that the flint itself is starting to fall apart. After about 60 or 70 shots, its life is over, so you need to replace it, but that's a difficult thing to do under gunfire, so hopefully something you plan ahead on. With that, though, hopefully one more shot. Freeze up! Fire! Get it working. I don't think I saw sparks. Sparks?
No sparks.
No sparks, no sparks. So as I was saying, the flint itself can be the problem. In this case, it's not sparking, which likely means it doesn't have a sharp, even enough edge to scrape the steel. That means that you might need to move the flint around, tighten it, or potentially work on it with a piece of metal. That's something that you usually wanted to avoid doing, is napping a flint starts to break it apart. And of course, napping a flint is a craft skill. It's something that you can learn to do in depth. Soldiers don't generally know how to do that. They're just going to hit the piece of rock until it starts making sparks. So it's a very good way to shorten its lifespan, but in a pinch, especially on the battlefield, you care more about yourself and getting out alive than you do about the little piece of stone. So generally speaking, anything that gets it started is good enough for you. See there, he's adjusted the flint, he's re-primed his pan, and with that, hopefully, we have one more shot. Freeze up! Fire! Ring rounders! All right, he wanted his own demonstration. With that, though, round of applause for our shooters. They did a wonderful job.
Yeah.
And with the weapons cleared, I hope you folks have enjoyed the demonstration. If you folks are on the tour or might like to join on the tour for the last 2 stops, Ben right over there will bring you back inside to take you around the tour. And I hope everyone enjoys their day.
there much of a kickback with those?
Not blank. When you load it
When you
live-
load it with a...
When you load it with a bullet, it, from my experience, kicks about the same amount as a 12-gauge shotgun. So, a fair amount of kick. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Head on over to our next stop.
Alrighty, so this here is our officers' quarters, and compared to most of the other rooms in our area, this is significantly nicer, and that's because it's for those officers, it's for the people in charge. And so they're expecting something a little bit nicer than what the regular soldier is getting. And to supply that, they'll actually be paying for it. So they're going to pay a significant amount of money throughout all of the things that they need to buy. For instance, they need to pay £400 just to get within the door at the bottom rank. So today that'd be about $60,000 that you'd be paying to get a job. So very different than how it is nowadays. But back then it was because officers were it was a very prestigious sort of title that you could have. It was usually people coming from a lot of money, so that £400 didn't really mean a lot to them. What did mean a lot is the idea of that glory of war, or that having a position that was particularly notable. So there was only so many jobs that you could pick from if you were from a rich family. You could join the clergy, you could become a physician or a lawyer, or you could become an officer, and so it became a very popular choice at the time.
Were these officers and were there any training so that be professional officers as opposed to, you know, it's just a job and
Oftentimes they'd have a lot of schooling because they're coming from rich families, so they'd already know how to read and write, things like that. Sometimes they'd go to some sort of military academy to teach them, though it wasn't always as much so. And oftentimes towards the later parts of the war, they were getting a little bit less and less experience because the more experienced people were dying. And so you got a large variety there. But a space like this would have been shared between some of the more junior ranks in the Army. It would have been shared between about 3 or 4 of them, and they would have shared this space and as well the space upstairs. So living room down here, bedroom up there, and these people would have been pretty young, sometimes as young as 16 for that bottom rank there, but often no older than 21, 22, because at that point, if you were still at those bottom ranks and you're in your early 20s, you're probably not a very good officer. You're probably, you should cut your losses and move somewhere else. But these guys were living in a space like this. They were very young, trying to make a name for themselves, very rich. And so oftentimes everything that they would buy would be a show of not only money, but sort of they were showing that they had the most money. So the paint up here on the walls is particularly yellow and blue because those would have been the most expensive colors at the time. And so you could show that you have enough money to waste it on making your walls look pretty. Things like the blue cone and that brown bag up there would have been sugar and tea, respectively. And oftentimes they would buy that, put it up on the wall there just to show they don't even have to use it. They can buy such a nice, expensive commodity and not feel like they're wasting it if they allow it to get old and bad. Now, in just a couple minutes, I'll send you guys upstairs to go take a look, but up there we do have our bedroom laid out, though you'll notice there's only one bed, and I did say that 3 or 4 men are going to be living up there. So in that bed, it's not because they would have been sharing that, it's because it's specifically important to us. It's from 1812, and so a lot of these, especially wooden pieces, did not survive the end of the war because of the bombings and burnings that happened in a lot of the forts. So that piece is significant because of that. Most of this other furniture is from the 1820s and 30s, so still very, very old in its own right, but that bed is still a decade or two older. That's because it was owned by Captain Nicholas Kingsley, who served over at Fort George, which is in Niagara-on-the-Lake, very close to here. And he served and died at Fort George in the early years of the war, and he gave that bed over to his wife. So that's how it survived. He died of something called the ague, which was sort of a catch-all term at the time for anything that makes you sneeze or cough, because they didn't know how to differentiate those diseases a lot of the time. And so if you sneezed, you coughed, that's the ague. Though based on what we know about it, it was probably pneumonia. And so he was he contracted the ague, and he was given mercury to cure it, which does not work. It actually made him significantly worse. He quickly developed terrible hallucinations, all sorts of different sleep paralysis, terrible nightmares, things like that you expect from mercury poisoning. And he quickly died during the war, even though he only had pneumonia, which isn't always a death sentence. And so he died actually in the bed that we have today, and so that's why we find it so significant and why we like to hold on to it. With that being said, though, I'll send you guys upstairs now to go take a look. Meet me back outside in just about a minute or two, and we'll head on over to the last stop.
Is that an oven over there?
No, that's actually a sort of like an old-timey version of a telecom or an intercom, and where you open that up, yell into the barracks that are on the other side of there, and close it back up again. So it only opens from this side where the officers are.
Thank you.
So this is our surgery, and as such I'll be talking about surgery and things that happen during the war like that. And so if at any point you feel squeamish or lightheaded, please feel free to step out. I would much rather you miss a little bit of the tour than throw up or faint or anything like that. Has happened before, which is why I'd like to give a little bit of a briefing about it. But probably shouldn't happen, so I think we'll be all right. But This is an active war zone at the time. And so, because of that, a lot of people are getting injured in the combat that is taking place, and the majority of it are musket ball wounds, people getting shot. And so you'll see a lot of men after a battle coming through here rapidly. And with no form of antiseptic, you need to now come up with a way to treat them quickly, and treat them without causing infection. And so, there's only so many choices. And what they eventually come up with is amputation. That is what they have decided to do at the time. So, you will start that process oftentimes by taking your finger and poking it into the hole that the musket ball has entered through and has created. And you'll poke around in there, feeling for the musket ball remnants, if maybe the limb can be saved, or what's going on in there. Oftentimes though, they would err on the side of caution and just choose to amputate your arm or leg, so that way it does not become infected from the lead musket ball that's now sitting in your arm. So first things first, they will take a tourniquet like this, and they will wrap that above your injury. So for this little demonstration, I'll just pretend that I've been shot right here in my forearm. So they would wrap this up and around my, just about my elbow, and they will tighten this until all of the blood flow has stopped in my arm. This is to make sure I don't bleed out when they come in with some of the more significant pieces in here, like this capital knife. Very large knife here. The sharp end is this curved side here. That's because it is particularly made to wrap up and around very quickly, to slice through your skin, muscle, and tissues in one clean go as best as possible, though oftentimes it leaves a little bit behind, so you'll have to go in with a more particular, smaller knife called the Catlin knife. And they'll take this, make more precise cuts, up until the point where your bone is completely exposed there. This entire process, especially as of now, you will not have any sort of painkillers. So they did have some created. They had opium that was widely used at the time, but it was also very expensive, and the surgeon would have been expected to pay for it if a soldier was going to get it. So unless you were a particular friend of that surgeon, you're probably not getting any, because it's just a little bit too expensive. And so instead, they were only giving you a little bit of alcohol, which they would wait until after the procedure to give you, so that way during the parts where you'll actually be bleeding, you don't bleed out from your blood being thin. But after that cutting on your arm and after your bone is completely exposed, they will be ready to take this large bone saw here. It's a hacksaw, and just in about a minute or two, a good surgeon would be able to pass this cleanly through the bone. Trying to make it as smooth as possible, so that way when they stitch you up later, it doesn't poke or prod through the skin and cause your wound to reopen. Next, they will take what is called a tenaculum, and they will tie a piece of silk onto the end right here. And this is good because you've just had all sorts of your veins and arteries exposed where that cutting has been done. So they will poke that through actually and use it to tie it shut as best as possible. So they did also know about cauterizing wounds at the time, so they also realized for some reason people were dying a lot after cauterizations from infection. It ended up being because they were not cleaning their utensils at the time. So all of these things, we try to keep them a little bit cleaner because I'll have to be holding them all day, but they wouldn't have even wiped them down after each patient. So you'll get somebody else's gunk on your blade when it's cutting through you. So lots of cross-contamination was happening, and therefore a lot of infections as well. Though after this tenaculum has sewed you shut, you're almost ready to go, and that they'll slowly release that tourniquet, making sure you're not bleeding too much. And then if you're good to go, they'll sew up the skin on your arm, and you'll be freshly delimbed. Oftentimes you might not be able to rejoin the army because you kind of need both hands to fire a musket, and you need both legs to march. So it's a little bit difficult to rejoin, though you did have a very good chance of at least survival. If you were hit below that elbow or that knee, and you were able to perform that amputation, you actually had an 85% chance of survival, which considering it's a old-timey sort of operation, very invasive as such, it's a pretty good survival rate, and so it's what a lot of people opted for instead of risking the infection. Do you guys have any questions before I continue? No? Alrighty, so one last thing that I would like to talk to you about actually invasive medical practices is this here. So if you have ever had a concussion, this is your Advil of the time. Instead of taking a nice little pill to help the brain swelling or fix you up a little bit, they will instead drill a hole through your skull. So they still do this in some ways nowadays, to help you out a little bit if you have very severe brain swelling, but back then they would often err on the side of caution. So this is the oldest invasive surgical procedure known to man. In fact, it is still, like I said, used today, so longest lasting as well. And that they will put this up against your skull, and there's a little saw blade type thing here, and that will drill through and actually take out a little coin-shaped piece of your skull, so that way your brain has somewhere to go when it expands. After that, there's not much else to do besides put oftentimes a coin or a piece of gold, if you're a little bit richer, into that hole there, and it will plug it up for you, and your skin will heal back over, and now you have a somewhat plugged hole in your skull. So, one other thing I'd like to talk about is in this box here. So, they had this idea at the time of the 4 humors, and this is not something we believe today in medical practices, but it was passed down by the ancient Greeks. And so the 4 humors was what they considered what ran your body. And so it was 4 liquid forces, it was a sort of ambiguous idea of things in your body that regulated itself. So one was blood, but there was also black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Those are the 4 things that they thought controlled your body. And so blood makes a little bit of sense, but black bile was excrement, and yellow bile was the other form of excrement, and phlegm is phlegm. So there's a lot more in your body than just those 4 things, though they didn't quite understand what plasma was, or antibodies, white blood cells, nothing like that. It was, so back then they thought that the diseases must be taken up in one of those 4 things. So by either adding more of another type or taking out some of the part that's causing the trouble, they thought they could cure you. So oftentimes that involved using something like this called a phlegm and making precise cuts on your body to drain out your blood. And so it was called bloodletting, and it was a very common practice, so much so that not only would doctors do it, but often sometimes your dentist or even your barber. So you'd get a nice little trim up here, and then you'd also get a trim specifically right here, in that they will make a nice long cut along here, have you bleed into a pan, stitch you up and send you on your way. This was considered a way to keep up on your health, and sort of like nowadays we might exercise a little bit, make sure you shave in the morning, and also bleed out a little bit. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to us now, but because it had been passed down by people much older than they were, it was common knowledge at the time. And so they didn't question it until they started to realize that a lot of people were dying when they did this, and if they didn't bloodlet them, they weren't dying. So something wasn't making sense there. One other thing that they were doing a lot back then, and I talked about it a little bit earlier, was treating people with mercury. So mercury tablets at the time were mercury plus chalk, just in a small sort of like a pill form, a tablet form, and you would chew those up, swallow them, and they were supposed to help all sorts of different ailments. They were very readily prescribed. The problem was they were prescribing it for the symptoms of mercury poisoning. And so if they gave you a little bit of mercury, you'd probably get a fever, you'd probably get a headache, and then so they give you a little bit more mercury. And you get worse, and they think, oh, we need to up the dose, and they'll give you more mercury and more, until you are dead. So you had a very short time frame to get better by yourself, or else these guys are going to mercury poison you to death. And so, other than that though, they did have a lot of remedies that were very effective and still used in different forms today. So one of which is opium, like I talked about earlier. Sorry, you're just gonna have to stay over there, ma'am. Thank you. So opium, very, very expensive, though it was being used as a painkiller. Nowadays, it's a little bit more, has more nefarious ideas that go along with it. But back then, they were using it simply just for simple pain killing, and that they'd actually put some in their coffee and tea if they were sick and drink that. There was no smoking or pills or anything that was being used for. As well, they were using peppermint oil for pain killing. So this has been used since 8000 BC, so a very long time that we have records of it being used. And it was used for mouth pain, tooth pain, stomach discomfort, all sorts of different things. And nowadays though, peppermint oil is a little bit more synthetic. Back then it would have been peppermint and oil. mixed together, sort of drained into there and given to you directly. So quite gross, but it did effectively work back then, and it still does in different homes now. As well here, we have kinchoka bark, and so this comes from a kinchoka tree, and back then it would have been just straight bark grinded and given to you. So you would have eaten that, taken it, and it was used to treat malaria. So malaria was running rampant through this part of Canada back then. There was lots of mosquitoes. Fort Erie is particularly very swampy. Nowadays we're lucky here. Malaria has been mostly eradicated, but 4 times as many people were dying from diseases like dysentery, malaria, cholera, pneumonia than they were from actual wounds in the war. So it was happening quite frequently. Kinchoka bark is what we use nowadays to help treat malaria, just in a much more refined form. They've derived it and dried it until they've evolved it into a synthetic pill, but it all stems back from that thing. Do you guys have any questions? Alrighty, in that case, this is the end of our tour. You guys might have a couple minutes to look around for yourself, but we do close at 5, so I don't know what time it is right now.
It's
4 minutes. So there's 2 different ways to get out of here. If you'd like to be through the front gate, or as well there's a sort of stone passageway out through the wall. Pass and see it there, and that'll
Interesting, yes? Oh my God. Thank you.
Take care, folks. Thank you for coming around.
Thank you. No more war. No more war. Yeah, thank you. Never war. People die. Never war.